Live from the District of Columbia, you are listening to the Black Fundraisers Podcast, a weekly podcast that celebrates, inspires, and equips Black fundraisers to excel and positively impact Black communities. With your host, Kia Croom.
Good day, good people. How you living? I'm Kia Croom, your host of the Black Fundraisers Podcast, your weekly podcast that celebrates, inspires, and equips Black fundraisers to positively impact Black communities. I want to thank you for tuning in today, and let me tell you, I've got an interesting conversation for you today. If you've been following our conversations on the racial leadership gap in nonprofits, you might recall that they've been more anecdotal in nature, totally valid, completely factual, but more or less anecdotal. And if you aren't up on these conversations, I'm going to need you to go into the Black Fundraisers Podcast episode archives and listen to Game On, How to Level Up to the Nonprofit C-Suite with my special guest, Diana Campbell. And I'm also need you to listen to one of the most recent episodes, The Cost of the Black Ceiling, with my special guest, Sarah Taylor. And you'll be caught up on these. And I mean that. I'm going to need you to get into these episodes, good people. So today, y'all, I'm joined by Sean Thomas-Breitfeld, the co-director of the Building Movement Project, an organization that has been at the helm of research exploring barriers people of color face when endeavoring to become nonprofit executive leaders. He's stopping by to dive into the empirical data from their latest report entitled Race to Lead Revisited, and he'll be sharing key findings, as well as the Building Movement Project's recommendations on what it's going to take to increase BIPOC representation within the nonprofit C-suite. Sean is also going to talk to us about what he believes it's going to take to create more diverse and equitable nonprofit workplaces across the sector. Y'all ready? I'm ready. Let's get into it. Hello, Sean. It's so good to have you stop by the Black Fundraisers Podcast. Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation with you.
So, Sean, tell us about the Building Movement Project and the Race to Lead initiative.
Sure. Well, let me just start by giving a little bit of background about BMP as an organization overall. So we are a national organization. We've been around for about 20 years and have, always had a race analysis in our work. And so when we were doing research on generational dynamics and tensions that were playing out in nonprofit organizations, that had a race analysis. When we were looking at how human service organizations grappled with the sort of mismatch between the staff and leadership and the community being served, that had a race analysis. When we were looking at how building movement supporting organizations were centering racial justice in their organizing and strategizing and working in partnership and solidarity with other organizations, obviously that had a race analysis. And so this body of work really builds on the experience of the organization overall. In terms of the Race to Lead initiative, there's about a dozen reports that we've written based on 2 surveys. And we started the research effort back in 2015 because we recognized that after a decade of talk in the sector about diversity being important, we really hadn't seen the sector move the dial much in terms of who actually held senior leadership roles in organizations and in the sector. So we wanted to do research to unpack some of those issues, understand what was going on, and contribute to a more honest and open dialogue in the sector to accelerate change and to accelerate the number of nonprofits that would in fact be led by people of color. And I think we're seeing an uptick in some of those transitions in the sector right now.
Interesting, an uptick in people of color in these leadership roles?
Yeah, I think that there have been some high-profile organizations that have, over the years, embraced new leadership where the incoming leader is a person of color and the organization had previously been white-led. I think we've also seen organizations that were built from the ground up as Black or Latinx-led organizations grow in really dramatic ways that has then made those organizations be very influential in the sector. And so I think we are seeing some positive shifts in the nonprofit sector, although I think that the pace of progress is still not quite enough.
I would agree with you, and I really appreciate the work that the Building Movement Project has been doing in this space. I want to say that I was sort of casually researching this topic a few years ago, and that was when I had my first encounter with Race to Lead. So I want to kind of dig in a little bit for folks that have not visited your site and accessed that content. What can they expect to pull down? And also, would you recommend that they visit the latest report, that is Race to Lead Revisited, correct?
Yeah, so the latest national report is Race to Lead Revisited. It is based on the survey data, the survey that we conducted in 2019, and there are some comparisons to the survey data that had been collected back in 2016. If people wanted to read the very first report that kicked off this whole series, and there are now, like I said, a dozen reports, that would be the initial Race to Lead report that was released back in 2017 based on the 2016 survey. I think a few things just for listeners to know. We're talking about data, and we're talking about a big data set, which is something that we are proud of, in part because we think that the combination of quantitative analysis from data with the lived experience that's shared through the focus groups and the quotes that people write into the survey really is important for providing a bigger picture for the sector. And we do know that, you know, data helps to move some people, and we know that stories help to move others. And so we're trying to bring those two things together with these reports. But so back in 2016, over 4,000 people participated in the survey effort. In 2019, over 5,000 people did. And so as we gear up to resurvey next year in 2022, our hope is that the data set will grow even more. But the survey looks both at the experience of advancement, opportunity to move up in organizations, and also at how people perceive fundamental issues of race in organizations. And so some enduring data points that we didn't see much change, say, between 2016 and 2019, is that people of color in our sample do express more interest and aspiration to lead nonprofit organizations than do white people in our sample. And so I think the important thing for organizations to recognize is that means that there are leaders out there. So I don't want to hear the excuse that, like, there's no one who's interested in taking on these crazy nonprofit executive director roles. I think the reality is it's more likely that people who want to be organizational leaders are going to be people of color. But I think what gets in the way is that organizations, particularly organizations that have not been very diverse, have not focused on inclusion and equity, have a whole set of biases that prevent them from recognizing the leadership potential of staff of color, or they have practices and sort of organizational orientations that make those organizations not appealing places for people of color to want to work. And so those are things that organizations have to grapple with if they're going to take the, you know, this current moment where everyone's sort of talking about DEI and really put it into a mode of, like, we're going to really commit to equity as a fundamental part of our organization, and we're going to then make the changes that then requires.
I was really, really fascinated by what you just stated, that these people of color, these survey respondents, were really impassioned. They were incredibly impassioned. And I thought about myself, and I thought about some of the people of color, particularly Black men and women in the sector doing the work. And the passion is undeniable, the intrinsic motivation, the lived experience, just the hunger, that internal, that impetus coming through something. My lived experience, I'm very transparent about having grown up in poverty and how that shaped and nurtured my desire and need to do this kind of work. Not just something that I want, it's really a need. I feel the need to connect with community and do something, right? And reading this, I was really fascinated to learn how impassioned these candidates were and how it was determined their white counterparts, right, don't necessarily have that. I believe the research, your data, which points out that these people of color are just as qualified, if not more, right? And those qualifications coupled with that lived experience, to me, that's a knockout punch. I'm true to this, right? Tried, true, educated, all of that. I agreed wholeheartedly. And I was particularly encouraged reading the Race to Lead Revisited summary. I'm still making my way through the report. It's really fabulous, good people listening. It's a great survey sample. I was really, really impressed, and really encouraged by how you all are scaling this and growing and really leaning in and reaching people and getting their feedback. Here at the Black Fundraisers podcast, we've had discussions on DEI and the racial leadership gap in nonprofits more anecdotally. I want to take a moment and dive into some of the more empirical data from Race to Lead that jumps out at you. What can you tell us?
Well, and first, I just want to acknowledge the full report is like 50 pages long, so don't feel bad about working your way through it over time. So you already highlighted some of the key data points. So one is that our data shows that there are not educational gaps between people of color and white folks working in the sector. And so I think it's just really important to dispel some of the myths that I think people have when it comes to this idea of like, who's ready to be an organizational leader. Our assertion is that people of color are both ready in terms of the aspiration and also ready in terms of the formal training and education to move into top leadership roles in the sector. Unfortunately, what gets in the way sometimes is that people of color don't report the same level of mentorship from within their organizations. This is not surprising, given what research about implicit bias has taught us about the tendency of people to mentor people who remind them of themselves. If organizations are sort of snow-capped organizations, to use a metaphor, then the people with the most position, power, and influence in organizations are then more likely to be mentoring younger staff who are white like themselves. Without organizations being really intentional about structuring mentorship opportunities that both do matching so that people are matched in terms of mentorship relationships with people who are not like themselves, and also training people who are going to be the mentors to provide effective mentorship to someone who is a person of color if they are themselves white. I think those are the sorts of change initiatives that organizations need to start thinking about and grappling with. Fortunately, people of color are finding mentorship outside of their organizations, but it would be great if people of color didn't have to go outside of their organizations to get support in terms of staying in their careers in the nonprofit sector. Another more striking data point was that when we asked survey takers about a range of factors that may have impacted their career advancement in the nonprofit sector, but when it's specifically about race, a third of people of color back in 2016 reported that their race had negatively impacted their career advancement. But with the 2019 data, that had increased to half of people of color reporting that their career advancement had been negatively impacted due to their own race. And so there are a few potential ways to look at that data. So one way is that things had gotten worse between 2016 and 2019 in terms of overt racism that people were experiencing. Another possibility is that the more honest and explicit conversations that we've been having in this country and in the sector about race has helped people reinterpret past experience and help people be more honest about the frustrations that they've been experiencing. And part of the reason I think it does have to do with like increased race consciousness is that when we asked white people that same question about how their race had impacted their career advancement, back in 2016, half of white people were acknowledging basically white privilege by saying that their race had positively impacted their career advancement. That had increased to 2/3 of white people saying the same thing in 2019. So I think those are some of the sort of key data points that I think really help to demonstrate that, yes, the racial leadership gap is fundamentally about race and racial bias, and that there are things that organizations need to be doing, particularly mentorship and support, to cultivate the leadership of people of color instead of continuing to ignore it.
It was very informative, very eye-opening what's there. What I've read thus far, spot on when you look around. And when I think back over my almost 20-year career in nonprofits, what I've experienced, I was the respondent in this report, quantitatively and qualitatively, right? I definitely identified. What I appreciate most about the report is that you capture both elements, that quantitative and qualitative piece. And I remember reading some of the respondents, and all of the respondents are anonymous, correct? I remember reading some of their feedback and experiences, just ordinary days navigating their working environment. Some of them were very raw and visceral. I think I remember reading one woman's encounter with a white supervisor who endeavored to have what was supposed to be a frank and candid conversation about race. And white fragility steps in, and when that conversation became uncomfortable for her, she just shut the whole conversation down. And what kind of message does that send to diverse employees and even white employees within an organization? I'd love to hear from you. Was there any anecdotal feedback that was particularly jarring to you in doing this research? If so, what is it? What was your reaction to it?
Well, first off, just appreciate that the quotes, the anonymized quotes, did resonate. We gather that data both through people being able to write in responses in the survey as well as through focus groups. And so when we were doing focus groups in late 2019 and early 2020 before the pandemic, one of the things that I was struck by was the level of frustration and the way that the frustration was articulated by younger people of color about nonprofit organizations. And it was striking both the skepticism that sometimes veered into cynicism about DEI initiatives in organizations in particular. So things like the frustration with DEI being done as a checklist, for instance. But also, I'm part of this exennial micro generation. And so, it was also then interesting to hear from younger people of color about the frustration and critique that they had of older leaders of color in nonprofit organizations, and the analysis that they were providing cover for organizational systems and practices that were unjust, that they were blocking change, that they were leading in ways that perpetuated white dominant culture. Like that whole set of critiques was just really interesting to hear, and hear in a way that was pretty widespread across the country. I mean, it came through more clearly or more pointedly in a few places, but it did seem like an interesting theme. And so I do think that something that organizations and leaders are then grappling with is the sort of scrutiny that leaders of color face when they move into leadership roles. And I think there's just some embedded contradictions or paradoxes of leading an organization and trying to build up an organizational infrastructure and leading in a way that centers values of equity and racial justice. And I think it's just going to be a challenging thing for organizations to grapple with over time. And I'm really interested in where all of that leads in terms of the conversations that our sector is going to be having.
I'm interested too, and I want to pull a chair up because you just dropped some seriousness, and we got to talk a little bit about this. Wow. So yes, I have experienced that exact dynamic where I've worked in some organizations, and I have encountered those individuals who have been with the organization for extended periods of time, extended tenure, and observe. And these are people of color, men and women of color, who resemble a little bit of that old guard and don't do much to help resist and fight the dominant white supremacy. They uphold it in a way. It's some reckoning that I think we have to do as a community and look at that, right? I've experienced that. So seeing that play out in this data, I'm gonna have to get a highlighter when I sit down with this report and just really sit with this information. I'm going to read all 50 pages of this report because I'm incredibly passionate about this as a young Black female executive. I make it very clear I'm here to stay. And I'm going to do my job and do the work that is meaningful. I'm here to stay. So I want to give some thought to how to personally navigate that kind of environment when you encounter that old guard and it's from somebody that looks like you. That's an interesting point you raised, Sean. You pulled that one out of the bag on me. I wasn't ready.
Well, part of it is that report hasn't been written yet, but we're working on it, right? So the next report that we have planned is going to look specifically at the data that we gathered from executive directors. So we had done back in maybe 2 or 3 years ago a report on EDs and CEOs. And so we're doing an updated one based on the 2019 data. But I just think one of the things that is interesting, and this is where, again, like a lot of this is anecdotal, right? So I am myself executive leader of color, right? I'm a Black gay man leading an organization. And so my peers often are other EDs of color who are sharing with me their frustrations about feeling like over-questioned, over-scrutinized, and experiencing pushback from younger staff of color. And I think it's particularly an acute frustration when they have taken over from exiting white leader. Because it's like, as a friend said to me one time, all these people are complaining about stuff that my predecessor put in place. They didn't have anything to say when the executive director was a white man, but now that it's me, everything needs to change. And so I just think we have to have some sensitivity and understanding of, one, is it possible that people have different expectations or higher expectations of leaders of color? Yes. Should they? Yes. Right? Like, I don't want to pull any punches on that. People of color should have higher expectations of leaders who reflect them, and should also feel, from my viewpoint, should also feel that they should have the ability to make demands of their organizations and have a voice in the organization. Does that mean that every view that they have becomes the policy of the organization? Probably not, right? Like, as organizational leaders, there are other things that we are balancing, grappling with. And I think it's hard sometimes, particularly with organizations with more of an activist culture, to balance the push for change, and particularly if the orientation to change is pushing from the outside, with the need to maintain and build an institution, which involves playing the game and resisting the game at the same time. And I just think that's a really hard balancing act. And, I think also I'm sure it's come up with conversations you're having with other leaders of color. There are real challenges that leaders of color experience around the financial sustainability of their organizations because of the racial bias in the funding world, right?
Hello.
So we know that there's a racial leadership gap. We also know that philanthropic redlining has been a practice in the sector for decades.
You better
And so
come on,
how
Sean.
can we expect like Black leaders to lead in transformative ways if they're still relying on the ability to present their organizations, pitch their organizations to funders who have not caught up with the shifts in our movement culture, right? So I just think it's all really complicated, and I think it's sometimes too easy to criticize the leader for not being authentic enough, for not having enough of a fast pace of change, without understanding that they're balancing also some real challenging dynamics in the ecosystem more broadly. Their viewpoint is not just the organization itself and the organizational structure, chart, etc.
If I had my tambourine handy, I would have pulled it out on that one. I'm telling you the truth. That is it is a very complex issue. And we, as people of color, as Blacks in leadership, we are held to a higher standard by everybody. And while we have the passion, we're doing the work, we know that we earn less, we get funded less, so it's like, well, dang, how many cards you gonna stack up against me here? I have the passion, the determination to do the job. So you're right, all of these complexities make it really, really difficult. But I'm encouraged, nonetheless, and committed to tooling and doing the work because, like I said, I'm here to stay, and I know that others are here to stay. So I'm encouraged by what we're learning from your research and this uptick that we're seeing, right? I want to go back to data. I was particularly fascinated by some of the findings that were in Race to Lead Revisited. And I'll just speak to a couple of them and ask for you to elaborate a little here. There was talk of this white advantage in the nonprofit sector, right? In white-led, particularly in white-led organizations. And also this whole misnomer about these DEI initiatives that feel more like diversity management in white-led organizations with Black employees. So in other words, there are DEI initiatives in place, but the people of color employed there don't experience inclusion. They very much do feel like, okay, you're checking a box, you're celebrating Juneteenth and giving us a day off, coordinating a potluck. You want us to bring some greens and cornbread and yams and so on and so forth in here. It takes more than that to create an inclusive environment. So those findings were really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to what we identified as the white advantage in the nonprofit sector, the first thing is just to acknowledge that, even in our sample, it was clear that survey respondents work for organizations where the most powerful positions are held by white people. So over half of all of our survey respondents reported that their organization's board, that their organization's senior staff team was more than 3/4 white. In contrast, though, more than half of those same respondents reported that the organizations were serving communities of color. And so I do think that we have to grapple with that mismatch because it has implications for the work that organizations do on the ground, but it also has impact on the experience of staff of color in those nonprofit workplaces. And so just to go a little bit deeper on the white advantage, one of the things that we were really trying to unpack was this workplace experience question. Because what we saw was that people of color were having the worst experiences when they worked in majority white organizations, and they were having more positive ratings of their organizations if the organization was more diverse. It was, though, interesting that both people of color and white staff who worked for more diverse organizations, groups were like more than half of the board and more than half of senior staff were people of color. Both white people and people of color working for those types of nonprofits reported more positive experiences. Just for example, whether they'd be happy working for the organization in 3 years, more positive, and the much smaller racial gap on that measure for people who worked for more diverse organizations as opposed to white dominant organizations. Whether they feel they have a voice in their organization, whether they see their organization offering fair and equitable opportunities for advancement. And the reason I want to lift this up is because if we think about the inequity in the way that funding flows in the nonprofit sector, funders who want to invest in organizations that are more diverse are probably also investing in organizations that just work better as more equitable workplaces. And that, should be something that funders are thinking about and grappling with, but also then putting some pressure and using their influence to say to those more sort of white dominant organizations, what are you doing to both change the composition of your organization, but also ensure that the lived experience of your workers is one where the nonprofit is really an equitable workplace. So we're interested in equity. You're right. Right now, I think organizations a lot of them are focused on diversity and sort of projecting that they care about diversity, but that is not translating into lived inclusion in workplaces. But I think it's also not leading to organizations that are actually equitable places to work. When it comes to the other findings related to DEI initiatives in particular, we were informed by the management research that is out there that has told us for decades that if DEI is implemented as a strategy of protecting a workplace from lawsuits, it may serve that purpose, although oftentimes it doesn't, but it doesn't change the organization's culture more broadly. And also that when DEI is implemented as a checklist, that doesn't work either. So organizations need to commit to holistic change at multiple levels. Organizations need to be thinking about at the level of motivation and organizational culture. They also have to be thinking at the level of organizational practice and behavior of employees. And they have to be thinking at the level of what are the organizational structures and systems that are embedded in the nonprofit. And that level of holistic thinking is really what starts to move organizations towards being more equitable. Another finding from the research related to this DEI section was we looked specifically at training because we know that is often the starting point for nonprofit organizations that are trying to do something. And we found that there's a relationship between the number of training topics that people reported and how positively people felt about DEI training overall. And so I think what that means for organizations that are, again, trying to get started on a path towards becoming more equitable workplaces is that you can't just do a one-time training on diversity and think that you're done. You have to think about equity from multiple perspectives. And so organizations need to be doing training on white privilege directly, explicitly. They also need to be doing training on understanding trauma-informed care that centers racial equity. They also need to be doing training on how to build communication competence so that everyone can communicate in a clear way and grapple with some of the difficult conversations that end up being necessary when organizations are committing to doing more work around race and equity. And so those are some of the things that we think are really important for organizations to be thinking about and for the sector to be thinking about when it comes to DEI initiatives.
Yes, organizations have to take into account your employees are smarter than the average bear, and your people of color, we're smarter than the average bear, and we don't want to feel like you're pulling the wool here. You really have to be willing to lean in. And if we're going to have the conversation, let's have the conversation, because I've worked in environments where when you think about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I experienced inclusion maybe in a team, but it didn't necessarily, the environment didn't feel that way outside of that team dynamic at the organizational level. So while I had an inclusive experience within my work group, and I did not experience that at the organizational level, so it was really the result of being on a team led by a manager that really took pride in inclusion, right? And we were kind of working against the tide here, and it felt that way. So, and what happens when we as employees have that experience? The data suggests that we leave. Your employees are leaving because they're not having that experience at the organizational level. And for individuals who experience inclusion at the organizational level, but have a manager that doesn't model inclusivity, that isn't bought into creating an inclusive climate and helping to foster that within the team and the organization, it's doubly difficult. And you're on the first thing smoking, right? So this isn't just good business. It's not just about good business sense. It's about retaining your talent, attracting and retaining your talent. And it's real. So we're going to continue having these conversations. And before we get into the bonus questions, for the good people listening who work in these roles, work in nonprofits, people of color, even white employees of nonprofits, leaders, managers, etc., how do they vie to participate in the research?
Yeah, well, so we will be doing another Race to Lead survey next year. And so I would just encourage folks to follow BMP on social media, because we always do big social media campaigns when we're trying to collect survey responses. The other thing is that, you know, as an organization, we've been working for the past 2 years to build a race equity assessment for nonprofit organizations. And, you know, we've been iterating, we've been doing beta testing, we've been testing it with cohorts of organizations. And, you know, I think it's been really just a fascinating learning experience for us as an organization to adapt some of the findings from our Race to Lead surveys and sort of fine tune things in terms of the most powerful questions to be asking staff about their experience in an organization, aggregating that information, and then providing the nonprofit with a custom narrative report that helps them understand how people are experiencing the organization, what are the key competencies that the organization needs to be focusing on developing, and then connecting them to resources and tools that already exist in the field that can help organizations build up some of those competencies. Like, you know, one of the things we've recognized is that a lot of organizations just have a tendency to avoid difficult conversations. And if an organization doesn't have the facility with dialogue, doesn't have the kind of relationships and trust that are needed to have, you know, real talk about what's happening in an organization, they're going to continue to just avoid as opposed to actually grapple with the change that the organization needs to make. Another thing is organizations that really are not thinking about voice and power are organizations that really can't grapple with what it takes to move towards actually being an equitable workplace. They may make it to the point of thinking about building an inclusive culture, but until organizations are willing to grapple with voice and power, they're really not going to achieve the kind of equity that we think is important for nonprofit organizations in the sector. So that's, you know, ways that we're both trying to learn from the field, but also contribute to change in the field. And in the end, our hope is that the assessment leads to insights and learning from organizations that are making change themselves. Because I have a lot of friends who are DEI consultants and capacity builders, and they are overstretched. Like there just aren't enough people with that level of training and capacity to meet the need and demand for support and change. And I think we need to be figuring out ways to equip organizations to build up and support their leadership and change agents inside of organizations to really have these difficult conversations and make real commitments to shift their organizational structure, organizational culture, and organizational practice to be more equitable as a nonprofit and as a workplace.
Well, you answered the last question I was going to ask. What can these organizations do to address the issues that are brought up in the Race to Lead surveys? That's some really good food for thought and nuggets in terms of where organizations can start, right? And we acknowledge that it doesn't happen overnight, but I want to be really, really clear. If you are going to step your toes in the pond in this work, you got to be ready to put that foot in there. We can't half step it. If we're going to do it, you can't half step it.
No, I completely agree. And I just want to encourage people that there are a lot of resources out there beyond, the Race to Lead research. And so organizations that are really thinking about what kind of change to make and, want to learn more about how to shift their organizational culture and structure, I would encourage groups to go to racialequitytools.org to a completely comprehensive sort of online library related to achieving and moving organizations to be more equitable. They just have so many resources. So I just think there's a lot that is out there. And I think when people say, well, we don't know where to start, we don't know how to get information, I would suggest that organizations do a little Googling. I mean, this is the topic of conversation in the management field right now. And I just think there's no excuse for claiming ignorance of how to move.
Agreed. And I'm so grateful for this organization you're leading in this effort and the knowledge, the data. Imagine having these conversations and just even endeavoring to do this without the voices from the Building Movement Project. I can't imagine that. So I'm really grateful for the work that you all are doing. And I will be sharing those resources, those links, everything that you shared here in the show notes for good people listening that want to dive in. I'm making it easy for you. Look for that information. So we're at the fun portion, although I've been having fun. This is fun to me. I hope it's fun listening, good people, because this is fun to me. I love this. But I want to, on a lighter note, get to our bonus questions, and we get a little personal here. You ready to get personal? All right.
Absolutely.
So we're all about self-care here at the Black Fundraisers podcast. It's been a heavy week all over the country. Stuff is going up, going down, everywhere you turn. Every which way but loose, as my grandmother would say. What are you doing for self-care these days?
Yeah, well, I have to admit that I struggle with this question. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I went to school in the Minneapolis area. So, I think the struggles of people of color in the upper Midwest, I feel and experience, right? So yeah, I want to just acknowledge everything in Minneapolis and Chicago and all over the country. And I think the reason that I struggle with the question of self-care is because I also want to maintain some perspective about my own needs and also my own privilege, right? So I work a job that is largely intellectual. I can perform it safely from home. My husband works in the restaurant industry. I have family and friends who have really had their entire livelihoods be upended by the pandemic. So it just feels sometimes a little self-indulgent to talk about my own self-care strategies and needs in the face of so much suffering and trauma. But, one piece of self-care, I think, for myself and as an organization is just the maintaining of relationships with people working directly on the ground in communities. A part of Building Movement Project is that we've always had place-based learning and place-based relationship and place-based initiatives. And so in addition to supporting organizing group on the ground in Detroit that is resisting and challenging gentrification and undermining of the economic and political power of Black people in what is the largest majority Black city, we also have longstanding relationships in Albuquerque and in New Mexico more broadly. And so yesterday I had the privilege of participating in a call that one of my coworkers organized with staff of direct service organizations working on the ground. They're working with people who are experiencing domestic violence, people who are facing food insecurity, people who are immigrants in New Mexico. And talking to social workers and advocates really helps me put in perspective my own experience, as well as the trauma that people in our communities are experiencing, unfortunately, on a day-to-day basis due to systemic racism, exploitative capitalism, and a broken immigration system. And so maintaining that connection to the ground for me is a really important part of my own sort of self-care practice, because it does provide some perspective about my own challenges and struggles.
No, I appreciate that and that empathy. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you holding space for folks that are going through. It's rough, it's real out here. And if those experiences and that perspective grounds you, I salute you in that. Some tough times that I think that it's important that we do that, hold space and take a moment to indulge in some gratitude around what's right, what's going right. My heart goes out to you and everyone that's struggling right now, because the struggle is real and it's not letting up. Every day, I had to cut my news off this morning and just get in the moment to get on here and chit chat with you. So it's real. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get nosy here. What are you listening to? What's on your playlist?
So I listen more to podcasts. So some of my favorite podcasts are, from like a movement perspective, Lady Don't Take No. I don't know if you listen to Alicia Garza's podcast, or How to Survive the End of the World that Adrienne Marie Brown does with her sister. I love both of those. I also listen to more so Brene Brown has this Unlocking Us podcast that I listen to pretty regularly. And then Work Life, it's a podcast that the TED organization produces that's all about organizational psychology and management. And then just for fun, I'm Black, I'm gay, I'm a nerd. So I listen to Sibling Watchery, which is a podcast that Bob the Drag Queen and Monet Exchange, who are winners of RuPaul's Drag Race, they do. It's like, sometimes it's silly, sometimes they're just talking about the current episode of the Drag Race empire. Sometimes they're talking about more serious issues. And Bob is someone that my husband and my sister had known before he became famous in the restaurant industry here in New York. And he's always been an activist. And so it's interesting seeing someone who's achieved a level of celebrity and fame also sort of stay true to their activist roots while also being a celebrity. So those are my podcasts. I mean, I also listen to pop music. So I have watched the Montero video a lot. Many times I've sort of been just watching that one on repeat.
I heard that. Well, if you listen, if the podcasts are bringing you joy and getting you laughing and, whatever it takes, whatever you got to do to get through these days, you do it, you go for it. And I'm a proponent of listening to podcasts on a variety of things, I think it's good to experiment. Like, how do you learn, right? I don't always have the luxury of sitting down and curling up with a book. I might grab a good article or turn on a good podcast to get some insight into some perspective, or in some cases to get that kick in the duff to do something that I've had on the shelf, get some inspiration. So I'm all about it. Well, I want to immensely thank you for stopping by the Black Fundraisers podcast. I've enjoyed you. I hope that you enjoyed us, and I know the good people listening will enjoy your contributions. I will be on the lookout. I'm going to follow the Building Movement Project, your social media, because I have something to say and look forward to participating in that next survey. But in the meantime, I'm enjoying the body of research you all have created around this very important subject.
Well, thanks again so much for inviting me to have this conversation. It was great getting to talk to you and share some of the work that we've been doing with your listeners.
Wonderful. And I know that this will resonate strongly with them. So I want to tell the good people listening, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you got some great value out of this conversation with Sean Thomas-Breitfeld, the Building Movement Project. As we shared, it's been a rough week across America, people, and even globally. So whatever you're doing, whatever you need to do, get your self-care on. Relish in gratitude and what's going right, and stay tuned, stay down, and keep your head up, good people. Be right back at you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Black Fundraisers Podcast. Like what you're hearing? Subscribe to the Black Fundraisers Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and leave a 5-star review. Connect with Kia on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter to stay connected.
Hello, thanks so much for stopping by. I am Kia Croom, and I'm a fundraising professional and DEI champion. I am in pursuit of racial justice for people of color and communities of color. I'd love to explore ways we can work together to change the world.